right?
8.
8. Okay. Good evening then. All right.
Thanks.
So let's get started. So one of the things that I've been focusing on last week has been about getting the code base to a position where others can start consuming it. Krish has also been helping with that. Krish is working on a library that applications can use, a Go library that applications can use to consume Cozy. What that library will do is give you simple functions that you just call in order to get clients or credentials to talk to different object storage providers. Um, and in terms of the actual code base, there was one question that came up that I want to discuss with everyone here. So in our API, in our KEP, we've had this concept of principal. I'll show you. Okay, this is a protobuf spec, and when you ask access to be granted for a particular bucket, and when you revoke access for a bucket, the way we the response to grant access gives back a string field called principal. So this is the request, and this is the response. So the response field, okay, no, I've changed it here. Let me go one commit before this, and we should see the right values here. Hold on. All right. So when we ask access to be granted, the response to grant access is the request, and this is the response. The response returns something called as a principal. So this principal was the term used by AWS for the account ID of whichever account was created as an IAM account or some other form of uh, token that's provided by AWS. The account ID was called as the principal, or is called as the principal. Now we need this account ID when we are, say, updating credentials, and when we are, say, revoking them. This is the handle which you use to specify to the object storage provider that this is the account that we're working with. So account ID or principal is kind of the same as is the same as a username or like an account ID. And talking to vendors, IBM specifically, Yanis, um, he needed, it wasn't intuitive what principal meant. And I think what Yanis brought up was a fair point, that principal is not a very intuitive name. It's not a natural name that says this is the account ID. For people who are writing drivers, um, even though we can explain this in documentation, I would think it's better to just call it account ID. So this is one change I wanted to introduce. I wanted to get your opinion on it.
Sounds fine to me. Don't
Yeah.
have a strong opinion.
Okay. Yeah, I thought people would be okay with this.
I mean, Sid, as a philosophy, I agree with what you just said. It's better to use a more generic description of a field than to pick something that maybe is popular with a particular vendor.
You mean as the principal, you agree?
In general, about what the fields is, what its purpose is, or what it contains. So account ID, if this is a principal's an account ID, then I like the idea of account ID.
Okay. Okay, that's good. All right, so let's go with account ID. This is good. So my next question is, do we see any use cases where we might want to change the permissions on an account? So say admin decides that a particular user who had write access to a bucket can now only have read access to that bucket without having to reprovision the workload. So is that a use case that we want to support?
It could always be done out of band, right?
Sorry?
It can always be done out of band. So the question is, do we want to have an API for it in Cozy?
Well, yeah. So, if they go and change the bucket access class, to say that anyone using this bucket access class now gets only read only instead of read write. So yeah. All the object storage APIs support this to update permissions or access for a particular account ID. Should we also support this? And the answer can be no. It's simpler not to support it.
I tend to think the answer should be no, because it relates to various other places where we take some information at construction time, so to say, like stuff that parameters that could be in the bucket class. And if you change those later, then those will not be reflected on already provisioned buckets under that bucket class. So shouldn't we be consistent there?
That's a good question. So access has been delineated from buckets itself.
Sure.
So, the life cycle of buckets and bucket access should not intersect.
Agree.
So in terms of the general theme of what you're saying, the same thing could apply to bucket access and bucket access class. So I'm just thinking it through and seeing if there is, something that we can't represent or something that we can't update that's there. And as of right now, I can't think of anything. So if you were to make this change happen, I'm going to open up the API. Oh. There. So bucket access class is here, there. So we have policy actions config map and parameters. So you're saying if parameters gets changed, bucket access class cannot be updated. Never mind. We can't even support this as it is right now.
Right. I mean, so the bucket access class is immutable.
Mm-hmm.
And then config maps are generally immutable, but Ching, wasn't there some enhancement to make a config map be mutable?
There was a make it immutable. That's a feature. That's a new feature.
Oh, to make it
actually,
okay.
it's already, I think it's a beta now, I think. Yeah, it's beta now.
Okay. So are they always or by default immutable? Or
no, I think initially it supports mutable. So this is just a new feature that you can actually make it immutable now.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there was a need for that, but it's interesting, Sid, because it might seem like if I change my config map, that would sort of percolate through the.
Right, but I think the credential change actually is something, in some environment is actually required. So, I mean, you probably want to support both. I don't think this should be always fixed or something, but in cases that you probably don't want it to be changed, right? That's why they have this feature, but not like it has to always be like that.
I see.
In some environment, you actually have like a password rotation.
That's not me.
Yeah, so I think
Very
if
good.
you assume that password can never be changed, I think that's wrong actually in those environments.
Understood. Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. But yeah, it's like yeah, it's access. It's more like authentication. So yeah, this makes sense. So given that config maps have that property, maybe by default we can make the config maps immutable. How do we make that feature happen? First of all, I want to kind of understand more clearly. Is this something that we should support? Being so again, think of it as we have the ability to read write first, or we have the ability to read only first, and then without updating, without changing the workload, or without having to delete the workload and redeploy, do we want to have the ability to change the permissions for that account? And is the only way by changing the bucket access class, or is there some other way if we do decide to go that route? So for the first question, so Shing, what if we said you can still do it, but you have to pull the workload down and then change some parameters and then redeploy it? It can be a rolling upgrade. That's fine.
I think that's maybe okay.
Yeah, if that's the case, then we don't have to update. We don't have to make this bucket access class or the policy actions config map immutable. We don't have to deal with any of this. We just say use a new bucket access or new bucket access request pointing to a different bucket class and upgrade. So does that mean, so I know today if like say for a deployment, if you call the update command, does it upgrade command, and does it upgrade any parameters? I thought it was only for a specific set of parameters like image name and a few others like args and things like that can change, right? Like what if I updated volume?
Which volume?
So let's say there's a deployment spec, and when you call kubectl upgrade on a deployment spec, or if you go and update the deployment spec to have new values, and then you do a kubectl apply on that spec, it Kubernetes how does Kubernetes react? Does it just pull things down and redeploy, or does it just change the parameters? Isn't there a specific behavior there? Does anyone know?
Yeah,
Once you make changes to the pod spec that sits within your deployment structure, then the deployment controller will, through a replica set controller, make sure that all your pods will be restarted. It's not doing anything in place.
I see. Okay. Okay, and if any parameter in the pod spec changes, this gets triggered, right?
Yes.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware, yes.
Okay. Okay. Got it. All right. In that case, I'm thinking through the scenario where someone wants new credentials. So what they would do is go update the pod spec to point to a different bucket access request, and that would trigger the deployment to redeploy this workload, and provisioning of the bucket credentials would go through the normal life cycle of Cozy, and it would get provisioned into the pod. So yeah, that's the way they can update credentials today.
Yes, but then we do assume that all the applications that would use that would use Cozy are built such that they can be easily restarted, so to say, and don't have a lot of state that gets built up at launch time, and then you want that application or that process to run as long as possible, potentially changing the keys, the access keys at runtime.
I mean, in a philosophical sense, that's the point of object storage. You store state remotely, so you don't have
Yes.
to deal with state locally. So going that way may be a forward-facing step. Maybe again, I'm not opposed to what you're saying. I'm just putting a thought out there. What do you
I
think about
think my point is, today, if you think of config maps and secrets, which you can mount as a volume, when the config map or the secret is changed and you have a pod that has that mounted, then the files, so to say, that pod sees on its file system, that container sees on its file system, will change. You don't know exactly when, but they are changed in place. So you can build an application which can by itself notice, oh, my credentials file has changed. I will just reload it in place and use those new credentials without being restarted.
Well, now so if the admin's purpose is to prevent the application from writing any more data, but just allow them to read, you're leaving it to the application now to reload if they wanted to.
Or to the admin. Because if you want your application to be restarted when the credentials change, then you can always use the trick of having a hash of the credentials as an annotation or a label annotation, I guess, on the pod spec, update the pod spec accordingly, and everything will be restarted by the deployment controller.
Or just restart the workload.
Yeah, well, that's basically what happens at that point, yes. So I'm wondering whether we should rule out any type of application which, for whatever reason, does not want to be restarted when access credentials or whatnot changed, but can be reconfigured in place.
That's a good point. So I'm not sure. That being said, pretty much all of Kubernetes assumes that why do deployments assume that the only way to upgrade is through a restart? And it's a rolling upgrade.
That's to upgrade when you change the image, but again, it doesn't say anything of how a pod consumes a config map or a secret.
Yeah, but this is not a config map; it's more like a volume. So, if you upgrade a volume,
a config map mounted as a volume.
Sorry.
A config map mounted as a volume.
No, I know config map is that's just the projection of it. I mean, like object storage is like a volume. It's analogous to a volume. It's not a special type of volume. It's just a volume. It's like changing. Say you have a EBS volume. It's like changing that. That would lead to a proper restart, correct?
Yes, but you want to limit. I mean, you want to do that as little as possible.
Are you? Sorry for jumping. Are you guys talking about taking away access?
Yeah, let's say you're taking away access. We have one model where in order to change any sort of access, you have to restart the workload, and another model where we're saying we don't restart the workload, we go update some files, but it's up to the actual application to choose to use the new credentials or not.
But what is the analogy? Is it for taking access from a volume? Is this the analogy? Because you're talking about mounted config maps, but mounted config maps, we're talking about updating the data of the config map, and then how does that represent inside the pod? But right now we're talking about removing access to something.
Yeah.
which is not
Fair
the same
enough.
thing as updating a config map, right?
Right. Nothing changes in the config map. You're right. Nothing changes in the actual credentials file. In case of buckets, in case of Cozy, if you were to update access, nothing changes in the actual credential tokens itself. It's the type of access that token has that changes. That's completely in the backend.
So the analogy could be for a volume that you would like to remove access for, or a config map or a secret that you want to remove access for a certain pod. But then, is there any way where the pod does not restart today? I don't think so.
Oh, but there's a difference between removing access and changing access from read-write to read-only.
Do you have that in secrets as well? Or in volumes? I don't think so. It's not really something that a transition which is common without restart. I'm not saying that it's not feasible. I'm just saying I don't think it's common. That's kind of what.
Yeah.
So if we set what a specific access key pair can do, first it can read and write. The application is running. Now we decide it can only read from the very same bucket. Then either we say we want the application to restart, but then afterwards still use the same access keys, because we just said that the credentials are not changing, or the application just keeps running, still consumes or uses the same access keys, but can now only read. What is the difference? So what is the difference between those two? How would an application act differently because it gets restarted, or when it just keeps running, but the credential it was using before now have less power, so to say? What's the difference?
So you're right. I mean, you could do this underneath the application, right? That's what you're saying, basically.
Yes.
You could make the update.
Anyway.
So if that's the point, then it could be done without Cozy altogether, right?
Right.
But I guess the question is, what do you want Cozy to do? If you need anything, so with volumes and if you have a volume read only in the pod spec, or you don't have a read only, when you change to read only, you have to remount it, right? So it's somehow different. But in a bucket case, if you don't need to change credentials and you make the update to the backing object storage, that the same credentials will now have read-only access to a bucket, that's kind of you're bypassing the
whole framework.
You're bypassing at least the pod in that sense. You don't need the pod to be in the loop. That's what you're saying, and I think you're right.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure if that's if we need to do something very special there. I mean,
we'll have to know that the credentials changed. Otherwise, our representation of whatever that credential, the access that credential has, is wrong.
There's two cases. He's saying if you don't need to change credentials, you just go and update the access.
Yeah. So the policy actions config map points to a particular type of access. That would change. So it'll say read write or read only. Now, if we go to the backend and make that update, then this needs to be updated to show that.
What needs to be updated to show that?
The policy actions config map.
The question is if we need to change credentials or not, right? One option is that the backend will update for the same credentials, that now these credentials have read-only access to this bucket, right? That's kind of a behind-the-scenes update.
Yes.
Right.
And the front in front of the scenes update would be, let's change the credentials to new credentials so that Cozy can notice that.
Yes.
And,
in which case I argue there are two options. In which case I argue that the file as seen from the workload's point of view should be updated in place, such that a workload which can work with in-place updates of the credentials file and then reload it automatically, etc., can do it that way. If an application is not designed that way, then it is likely, somewhat likely designed to basically crash when it's using credentials that don't work, after which the pod will be restarted. The application will then, when the pod gets restarted, well, when a new pod gets created, see the fresh credentials, start with them, and happily continue.
So you're saying we decommission the old credentials?
You're saying replace them.
Yeah, so the old credentials don't work. Not just replacing the pod, but if you had the old access key and secret key, it shouldn't work anymore. Otherwise, this model wouldn't work, because if you didn't say that, let's say you want the pod to use new credential or new types of access, and the application itself doesn't reload. It's not designed to reload. It just works with, it reads when it starts up, and then it never reads again. It just has it in memory and just uses it, which is what most applications are like today. So if it continues to use the credentials, and if it can talk to the object storage in the same way it always could, then the whole point of this update is moot, because the update wouldn't do anything. But if we were to say the old credentials will not work anymore, then you can reasonably expect the application to crash if it doesn't know how to reload. And at that point, when it does restart, it'll when it restarts and reads the credentials the next time, it'll have the new credentials.
Should this be responsibility of the applications itself, rather than we are debating whether we should support it or not? Because if the configure map is immutable, then this just can't be changed. But if it's mutable, then the application should be able to support that.
Yeah, and we can make it a part of the library that we provide somehow. I don't know how exactly we'll do that.
But the application will reference the bucket access request, right? Not the config map directly.
No, I think she means credentials, just the actual credentials, whether it's config map or some other way, right, Shane?
So the config map. So basically, for the configure maps or secrets, right? So if it depends on whether it is immutable or mutable. If it's immutable, that means Kubernetes will not be watching it. But if it's mutable, then Kubernetes will be watching the change. So it's not like we can even stop that from happening. So that's why I'm like, I don't know what we can do to stop that, if that can be changed.
We're not mounting a secret directly. We are actually creating files based on the secret. So as a response to create access, we get back two fields. One is called it's here. One is called credentials file contents, another is called credentials file path. So based on, so these two fields would actually go into a single secret. And then based on this path, we create a new file inside the pod, and we put the contents of this into that path. So it's not a secret per se. It's a file that we create, Cozy creates inside of the pod and mounts it.
Okay.
So we have the control to say that, replace this file, or we can make it a memory map file. We can do a lot of things to, make it such that it has new credentials if needed, or it doesn't update on its own, whichever way we want. However, our question is now, should we update the pod while it's still running, or should we force the pod to restart and then update it?
In the files, when data is mounted into files, I think the expectation is to update the file. I think, unless I'm. Yeah, I mean, that's the interface, right?
Yeah, I think that's fine. But we can't expect the application itself to start using the new credentials just because we replace the file, correct?
We can't expect maybe that side effect, but
yeah.
But perhaps it can be automated if that's the desirable. I mean, I think that the capability of you using a file within a pod is that this is a dynamic content for for injecting information there, versus an environment variable where you can't really change. And if you do change that, the intention is that there will be some form of restart.
Yeah. I mean, we can technically change them, but you need like ptrace access or something like that, or a shim, and it's not
environment.
Yeah.
But I'm saying in terms of the expectation, right? I'm sure it's possible to inject anything, right, to a running process, but the expectation is that the environment will be there when you start, versus files which may may get populated later on, or changed.
Yeah, fair point. So okay, so let's say we go with this approach where we update the file as the pod is running. How do we facilitate that? Like, how do we allow the admin or user to say that, hey, use new credentials instead of old?
I have some code around which does kind of that for config maps.
No, I know how to do that. My question is, how does the admin say, I want to use new credentials? Like, what kind of actions does the admin take, or the user, what kind of actions do they take to change the access?
Normally it's handled automatically. You watch for the change and then.
No, I mean more like the admin, when they provision, or the user, when they ask access for a bucket, they create a bucket access request that points to a bucket access class, and that ends up creating a bucket access object that which is what we use to create the files in the pod. Now, if you're changing this access, what fields need to change? Does the user go and change the bucket access request to point to a different bucket access class? Is that how it will look?
So this is you're imagining this is a user request change. So a user will have this will trigger this path for updating the access. Is that?
That's one way, or say or it could be that the admin goes and directly updates the pod to point to a different bucket access request. Or how would that look? I'm just trying to imagine what that experience would look like. So we can say it's the user, but that doesn't make much sense, because we're expecting the user to not have to exactly behave rationally every time. So you can't assume malicious users in this case. So let's say admin is the one that controls this, and the admin decides that they want to change the type of access a workload has. How would the admin do it?
So the update to the bucket access, is that kind of where we are?
Yeah. Maybe it's the update to the bucket access. Maybe it's update to the pod itself that's using the bucket access. But what's the process?
But the pod has a reference to the bucket access itself, or just the bucket access request?
Bucket access request.
Okay. So, I mean, it's always possible to. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think it's really possible. You can make anything mutable in the pod, but like if you have volumes, currently volumes are not mutable in the pods. So I would expect, at least right now, that similarly the bucket access will be immutable, at least for compatibility. Not sure if it's forever, but so if you created a pod, that's you're wired to some bucket access request, and if somebody wants to tear down this workload and reconfigure it, either it's an admin that goes directly to the bucket access and makes changes. That's one option, which seems fine. I mean, seems like it's possible to have the cozy controllers operate on that. But if the user wants to do that, it typically will tear down and set up a new workload spec.
Makes sense.
Yeah, if it's initiated by the user, it should go through likely a new bucket access request. A user cannot update a bucket access. An admin could.
And probably a new pod as well.
Well, if there's a new bucket access request, then indeed there will likely be a new pod. And that seems kind of fine, because then this is initiated by the user who owns the application in the first place. So when there's like downtime to be expected for whatever reason, then the user can plan this accordingly.
Yeah, that's
I think
like
it's more of an
that's like using a whole new bucket access request. That's fine, I
yes,
think. Yeah.
yes. But in case it's an admin who wants to make changes for whatever reason to the bucket access, then that should not directly impact the running application, because the admin doesn't own that one. It doesn't manage its lifecycle, but it could make changes to the bucket access, which can then be reflected to the backing object storage system.
Yeah, I could see this being an actual use case. Let's say if there is an application that uses like say 10, 20 different buckets, and you know, different users have in that one application, different users have different accesses to the same bucket, then you might want to revoke some users' privileges. Rob, who used to you know, be a part, you know, who used to be at the meetings earlier, he talked about a workload like that. He was the admin for Quay.io, and when engineers left, or you know, there was an internal Red Hat Quay.io apparently, and when engineers left the team, he would have to revoke access specifically for those engineers, or whatever buckets were created for that engineer, but not tear down the application itself. So I can see this being a real use case, something like that, where you forcefully change access or you revoke access without really pulling the application down.
Indeed.
Go on.
No, yeah, I agree that that's a perfectly legit use case.
Okay, cool.
So
All right.
where is it in the bucket access? I mean, so that I understand, if the admin wants to make any changes, what can be modified right here?
Well,
just replace it, the secret name.
Well, if they change the policy actions config map data, then we know the access itself has changed. So we'll have to go through the life cycle of updating the created secret with the new well, maybe we could keep the secret as it is, but just update the policy actions, which is what states what kind of access the user gets, the account gets.
So this is a reference to a config map, or a data of the config map, the actual data?
Yeah, the actual data. That looks cumbersome, to be honest.
Yeah, because then if it's a string, it's not a config map.
Yeah, it's originally a config map, and then it gets copied over to the bucket access, because the idea originally was this is not mutable. I mean, we can still say that it's not mutable this way, and we can say when we end up adding fields in the pod for buckets, which are not volumes but actual fields, at that point we can handle this much more gracefully. And for now we can say this is immutable and you can't do that use case.
So what would be so read only will be inside of this policy actions?
Yeah.
How's that? How would that be manifested for I don't know, S3 protocol?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, I'll show you. I'll just open up AWS S3.
Does the bucket policy like XML or anything like that?
Yeah, it's a JSON.
JSON, yeah, JSON.
Yeah, bucket policy examples.
But these are not to be
looks like
exposed to the pod, right? It's irrelevant to the pod. It's just to the back end.
Right. Yeah. So it looks like this. You say a love, and then you say principal, which is the ID. You can do multiple principles. And action is put object and put object ACLs, and on which bucket. So you can do all kinds of things here. It can be get object, list objects, whatever.
So the point in the bucket access is that if the admin wants to set the policy, we might want to make that mutable. Is that the thought process? But for now, you're saying that it's not mutable because we will need to apply that or reapply that to the driver.
Yeah. Well, for the admin itself, right now it looks like this. So the only way they can, the way we specify the access policy today is through the bucket class. So bucket class has a field for the config map that points to the policy. Now, once a bucket access is provisioned from the bucket class, this policy is copied over to the bucket access. But when it's copied over, it's not a pointer to the config map anymore. It's the actual data, escaped string.
Right. So it's copied, right? So we have a clone of that class, basically.
Yeah.
That's fine. And then if I do want to make that mutable for whatever reason, because I want to make an actual update to my
access
credentials, right? To my credential, actually, but basically to my account, then I would go and make an update to this field and expect the reconciliation path to go through the driver and update the account policy, right? Basically.
Yeah, we could do that. We could actually do that. But the admin workflow itself, they would have to create an escaped string with the new policy actions and then set it, which is
that seems a bit weird.
Yeah.
Because
it's possible still. We can probably give a CLI utility or something. I don't know, but yeah, it's not intuitive.
Can it be just a raw JSON? I mean,
it has to be escaped because you can have new lines and all kinds of things in the JSON.
No, I mean, can't it be just an a map string object, sort of like I mean, you can define that, but
the thing is, there's no common abstraction for all providers. That's why we use a opaque string right now.
I see. So you don't even want to assume this is a JSON
or even a map. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But why is it a config map in the bucket?
Because the config map could have. The config map is expected to have.
You mean in the class, right?
Yeah, in the class. Yeah. The config map can have just one string.
Well, it's a config map is always a key and a value, so we would need to specify what the key is, right? And then the value could be copied over.
I need to check with this again, but I think we have a specific key we look for. Jeff, can you remind me?
Why isn't this a string already if we only support one string anyway?
Because when creating a config map, the escaping is done by kubectl.
Yes, but you'd still need to somehow do the same for the string that goes in the bucket access.
Yeah, how would you do it? That's my question.
No, I'm just saying that there's this separation between when you're doing it in the bucket access class, then things may somewhat be fixed up for you. But if you're acting on a bucket access, then you're on your own. Why do we not use a string in the two cases? Because to me now it's a bit weird.
So
yeah, I agree. It makes sense to just have it. If we're going to handle any escaping, it's not too bad, right? Escaping JSON, it's not that difficult. You probably won't do it manually. You just use something, but you encode it. In many cases, you'd even base 64 even here just to make streamline value if that's desirable. But even without it, it's pretty
Okay,
easy
yeah.
to
So,
include it.
so you're saying in the bucket class itself, let's not use a config map.
Yes.
Yep.
We could just have a
Or
string.
yeah, yes. I don't really see why this config map needs to be in between.
Right, an
You're
opaque
saying-
string. If it's an opaque string, it can be an opaque string in both.
Yeah. I see what you mean. And this can be base64 encoded. So, and base64 encoding is straightforward and easy.
Yeah, we could certainly do that. I think the reason is, as you explained, Sid, is that we just thought for escaping and more complex values for the access policy, the config map might be nicer, but it does add an extra resource in the equation and brings up what does mutability mean, you know? So if you eliminate config map, then we have contained it better.
Fair enough. I
We have
like it.
control over what we want, how we want to handle things, or it would be easier to handle mutations, I think, down the road.
Right. So, okay, one more question then. In the bucket access spec, do we point to the bucket access class anywhere?
Oh,
We don't. Okay. This is
no,
great.
no, we don't. Right.
It's copied, right?
Yeah, it's copied. Yeah, this is great. Okay. So,
For B. Yep.
okay, great. So yeah, if this was base64 encoded string, then you just update the base64 encoded string here, and we should be good to go. We should be able to use that to create new credentials, and then the pod gets to use the new credentials. We update the file live. Correct? That's what we said, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, cool. I like this.
Basically, this is the main access class, right? That's what specifies the real access.
Right. This is the main access, yes. Or access
Information, right?
Yeah, access information. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, this makes things easier. Yeah, I like it. Anyone, any other thoughts?
Sid, to make sure you and I can sync up on this, but to make sure I'm understanding what agreement seems to be is that we would remove the config map reference in the BAC, and instead we would have a base64 encoded
String.
access policy string, right? Okay, and then we just simply copy that from the BA during BA instantiation. And the field can have the same.
Yeah, I think I remember one more reason we said config map. I think we said config maps are more readable.
Well, that was it. Yeah. Easier to create, more readable, human readable, but yeah, a base64 encoded value won't be readable, but maybe we don't have to base64 encode it, but then we have to deal with the escaping.
Yeah, inside the config map. Okay, so let's go back one step. What if we said inside the config map, it's not base64 encoded, it's not escaped, it's the actual key value pair. And if it is key value pair, then we go back to this question of why not make this a key value pair?
But if you go back to your AWS thing, it's not a key value pair.
Each value can be nested object as well. JSON
Interface, I mean, like map string interface.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's
In config map, you can't do that.
The string values will still be encoded somehow, right?
Yeah, true. All right, I'm convinced.
The benefit of making the first level visible is that it does provide some visibility rather than having, the entire string. So can you show back the AWS policy for a second, just that we look at the same thing maybe. Well, yeah, in this case, it won't do much, right? The version and statement will be the top level. Doesn't make much.
True.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, you could say you'll put this in, but no, at that point we'll do conditional processing, and that's not going to work.
Right.
Yeah. Just base64 encoded, and if they want to, and in kubectl describe, we could decode it and show it, if they really wanted to see. You know what I
That's
mean?
always true.
Yeah. So we could improve the readability that way.
So you're saying this entire block will be encoded in that field, that the config map field that we were talking about earlier?
Right. So in bucket access class, instead of having a config map here, we would just have the encoded value, base64 encoded value of this.
You know what? Let me ask you something. The base64 encoding is just a way of making it opaque, but if you just drop that and you keep it just an opaque string without encoding, right?
Sure.
You can still encode in JSON any string. It's JSON will that's what JSON does, right? JSON can encode any string as a value. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to make any effort for JSON to do that.
It's
so
easy. Yeah, I mean, base64 encoding is for some
I'm
reason.
just saying it doesn't change. You can still use JSON, the opaque string as is. You don't have to base64 encode it.
I mean, it's an escape string. It's not an opaque string, right? Like it has to be an escape string.
It doesn't need to be an escaped string when you input that, but it will be escaped by JSON encoding, right? JSON will encode it and escape every character there. That's what
So
JSON
you
does.
mean by default, it's going to do it like kubectl when it decodes it and uses it. Is that what you mean?
So when you mean kubectl, you mean when I write a YAML, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to encode a string into it,
Mm-hmm.
I can use YAML tools for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I use JSON, I need to use JSON tools for that. But there's ways to encode strings into like complete strings into YAML, for example, without any need for too many hoops. You just put a pipe character and you go one line below and that's it. You can paste in whatever you want. So what I'm saying is that the base64 encoding is not mandatory. If we prefer visibility,
you can't have more than one line. That's the problem. If you have more than one line, then the JSON breaks because you're expecting a string field, but it's not really a string, right?
What do you mean JSON breaks? JSON doesn't break with new lines. JSON is agnostic to white space.
If there is so you're saying anything between double quotes. So if I were to put the exact JSON string, like with the opening braces, keys with double quotes, the colons and all that inside that string field, it's not going to work.
It is going to work if it is going to work, for example, inside a YAML.
Yeah, inside a YAML, it might work, yes, but not
for sure it does. And inside a JSON, if you are the author of a JSON, you need to know how to encode a JSON, a content within a JSON. But what I'm saying is that there's enough tools around the API here, so you don't have to lose visibility if you don't want to and go to base64.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer base64, but you're right. Technically, you don't have to. Yeah, it would just work. I mean, assuming you know how to write JSON.
Or YAML. I mean, YAML will do that just fine.
Right? Yeah, YAML would do it just fine.
Well, it could even be a completely different serialization format for particular types of object storage.
Right.
Like
that doesn't
AWS uses JSON formatting. I would not be surprised if Azure has some type of XML-based policy definition language.
Like based on what Guy is saying, it doesn't matter. Indeed. Whatever the format is, you put it in there as an opaque string.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's up to the provisioner to interpret this somehow.
I mean, we will have to know how to interpret it too, because if you're doing something like kubectl describe, I don't want to just throw a string out there. That's not easy to understand. I would rather, like, I really don't care how it's shown here, but I care more about like how it is presented in something like kubectl describe.
But the
Like,
string
yeah,
can be readable. I mean, like you see in the JSON of AWS, right? The string itself is readable and can have, you know, spaces and new lines and everything.
Wouldn't it be more readable? Like, okay, so tell me this: when you do a kubectl get object -o YAML or -o JSON, it's not as readable as kubectl describe object. So
Indeed.
wouldn't it make more sense to, you know, optimize for that rather than like have some kind of encoding here that's easier to read?
But
I would
it,
optimize for YAML at first. I'm not sure if that's what everybody else feels, but I think YAML will just show the content pretty simply.
Mm-hmm. And you can still optimize the describe. That's what you're saying.
If you have more visibility into the content and you want to guess, try to JSON parse that, you know, do some more guesses there. But I'm not sure if it's really needed, because I would assume that the content of that, even though it is opaque, it's still structured somehow, so that, you know, the author will you know,
only the admin has to read it.
input
The
that.
user doesn't have to read it. Oh,
Yeah, but the admin will also construct it somehow, right, from a file. So
So one second. So I want to go back to Shing. So Shing, does that make sense? Like it'll be some form of string representation of the actual policy config instead of the pointer to a config map. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, just haven't seen this type of pattern,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. I mean, go ahead.
It's really as if we embed a config map with only a single key and value in it, and we don't mention the key. You have the same with config maps where the value can only be a string anyway.
Yeah, he's saying it's like config map with only one key value.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
How about this, Shing? I think you know, I want everyone to feel comfortable with this. So maybe we bring it up again on Thursday.
Yeah, I think this needs more discussion.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about this proposal.
Yeah. The whole idea behind this is, Shing, if you want to be able to update credentials, update access for a running workload, you know, for a bucket in a running workload, then how do you do it? And based on the entire discussion, it seems like the best way to make it happen is if this field was not a pointer to a config map, and rather it was just a string. If that were the case, then inside the bucket access, when this is copied, we can just go update it.
Mm-hmm. So you don't have to worry about like pod is getting crash or something. Just
right.
Like it's like we're in more control.
Yeah. And also one more advantage I can think of is, you know, there is a possibility here of deleting the config map. Like you create the bucket access class, but before the you know, the controller reads the config map, someone goes and deletes it. So, you know, it's possible like it got through the admission controller, but it didn't get processed. I mean, it's a weird case and it's a user error kind of scenario what can happen. I don't know if that's even meaningful. Yeah.
Probably need to think about this and discuss about this again.
Right, I think so. I think that's important. So let's bring it up again on Thursday, because yeah, you know, like I was saying, I think everyone needs to be comfortable with this before we go forward. But this doesn't you know, factor into our API review or KEP or everything else that we've been doing. This is like an additional feature we're thinking about. This can be done. You know, it's not a stopper or blocker in any sense. So we're almost out of time. We're out of time already. So quickly, I want to say a few things. One is please review the KEP. I'll ask Jeff to post a link to the KEP PR in SIG Storage Cozy channel. Yeah, I would like everyone to take a look, because it's a summary of all the discussions we've had. and you might have missed some discussions, or we might have missed some points in the CAP. We need your feedback on it, so that we can speed up the API review process. The other is that's one part. The other is I would like all of you to speak more about Cozy wherever you can. So, for instance, if you're going to a meetup, if you want to give a talk, please apply for it. KubeCon is coming up. The call for proposals is open right now. So please, if you're considering, speaking there, I would encourage you to speak about Cozy. If you do, decide to apply, talk to me once, because I want to make sure two people aren't applying for the same thing. That's the one reason. And other than that, if you want to tweet about it, write blogs about it, you're all welcome to do it. And I would like someone to write a blog in Kubernetes.io about Cozy. So whoever is willing and interested, ping me directly or on SIG Storage Cozy. Yeah, that's about it. We'll talk again on Thursday. Continue this discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
That's
Bye.
Thank you.